Welcome to Gray Maybe, a podcast and social experiment based on this season's topic, abuse. My name is Jillian Schmitz. I'm a professional dancer, actor, teacher, author, artist, mother, and cat lover. Through my own personal journey of recovery, I've found that things aren't just black or white, or a simple yes or no. For me, in my recovery, there has been mostly gray area and a lot of maybes. In most of my stories, you can find the gray maybe. I will be sharing my own process through personal stories and interviews with others in an effort to destigmatize, bring awareness, and find recovery from many types of abuse. If you'd like to share your story, please email graymaybestories@gmail.com. graymaybestories@gmail.com. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please subscribe on whichever platform you're using to catch future episodes of Gray Maybe. A note before we begin. My stories and the stories of others on this podcast are told through the lens of our own experience. The revelation of our process is ours to tell. If you disagree with the views or stories on this podcast, know that we are not speaking on anything other than our own experiences and viewpoints. Take what you like and leave the rest. Nothing expressed or mentioned in this podcast is an endorsement or is meant to be taken as advice. It is strictly the sharing of our own experiences and our own recovery. Any feelings this podcast activates in the listener is for the listener to process and recover from. Any criticism you have based on these experiences and choices are yours, and they are not anyone else's burden to carry. Trigger warning: intimate partner violence, rape. Welcome back, everybody. My people who have been here since the beginning, my people who have come in the middle, and my people who are just finding me now. Welcome to Gray Maybe, and welcome back to myself. The Gray Maybe podcast has been on hiatus for the last year. A lot can happen in a year. I got pregnant and had a baby. If you've been following the podcast all the way from season 1, this might be surprising. My feelings about pregnancy, birth, babies, children, and parenting feel so different today when I chose it versus back then when I didn't. Since our last season, my producer Roderick and I discussed many ideas for future episodes, including the possibility of pop-up episodes. But balancing my time with a new baby and fitting the podcast in was unrealistic, and to be honest, nothing was screaming specifically. So we waited. 3 days after the 2024 election, emerging from disbelief and slowly into acceptance, I knew what the topic would be. I texted Roderick, Gray Maybe Season 4, topic abuse. Because I explained, America went back to its abuser. I'm not interested in debating about the particulars of the election, if you know me, hard to believe, or about the particular candidate that won. I do, however, think it's a fair statement to make that the candidate that did win triggers trauma in many people who have experienced abuse: physical, emotional, financial, sexual, spiritual, and racial abuse, to name a few. I am one of those people. I'm hoping by sharing my experience and the experience of others, we cast a light on various ways abuse can be experienced, and that those who wish to feel seen, heard, and are seeking recovery feel supported in beginning that journey if they haven't already. Deep breath. Here's my story. I lost my virginity in the winter, not long after my 16th birthday. It was a big decision to me that I spent much time anticipating. I've never regretted my choice. I was ready. What I wasn't ready for was this specific type of relationship. It was cold outside, and there was a new blanket of snow covering my town. The fresh, crisp smell of winter was intoxicating. I had been dating Don for 4 months. He was a year older than me. He played for the high school football team and was a respected powerlifter. He had intense blue eyes and dark hair. He seemed shy, but was popular. He seemed mysterious, almost like he had a secret, or was above high school shenanigans. We became a couple almost immediately, and we were inseparable. He was so sweet and honest, and while I had dated boys that had these qualities prior, his attentiveness to me filled a very deep void. I felt like he really liked me, and at the time, like I didn't have to try hard to keep him. He brought me flowers and wrote me love notes. He fawned over me, showering me with compliments, and humorously declared his devotion to me. He paid attention to nothing else when I was around. I was fresh from a series of disappointing dates and one short-term boyfriend. He fed my heart and ego, filled up my low self-confidence, and I consumed every ounce of his attention and became addicted to his love. That crisp winter night, I had told my mom I was staying the night at my friend Natasha's. Of course, it was a lie. I was planning to stay the night at Don's basement where his room was. He had a ground-level window, which was extremely easy to climb in and out of. Like a good sneak, I had my loyal friend Natasha in on it. She knew to call me on my cell phone. This was the 90s, and it was the early flip phone model, which was for emergency use only due to the cost. If my mom happened to call her, she would say I was in the bathroom and that I'd call her back. I would call back from my emergency phone, crisis averted. Of course, this worked because it was before my parents had caller ID. Ah, the freedom of the 90s. Don called me and told me plans had changed. His friend Ian's mom managed an apartment building in the area, and one of the units was going to be empty, and he had a set of keys. It was the perfect plan and perfect timing. I packed my PJs, some candles, and oranges for some reason, maybe for the morning, and headed out in my white hatchback Mustang, blasting LL Cool J's new album. Don wasn't a virgin. He had more experience than me. He had a girlfriend prior and a sexual experience before that. It might have bothered some people, but it didn't bother me. Don never pressured me to have sex, so when I alluded that tonight would be the night, he planned accordingly and purchased protection. I arrived at the apartment building and we set up camp in one of the vacant rooms of the unit. It was intimate, romantic, and private. My first time was a pleasant one. I didn't have pain. It was even pleasurable. He was sweet, gentle, and never pressured me or moved faster than what I was comfortable with. He kissed me sweetly and held me. He told me he loved me and I loved him. It was how I'd always imagined it. It was perfect. Now is part of the story that gets a little sticky. The following events I remember in perfect detail. However, the memories of what comes next are different because as I recall them in my mind, I'm never in my body experiencing them. I only remember them as a silent witness watching it all happen, like watching a play or a movie. Sometimes I'm watching from different areas of the room, but never from my direct point of view. I can't say how it started exactly. I guess you could liken it to a small crack in the infrastructure of a bridge. At first, the damage is small, unnoticeable really. The bridge still holds strong and safely. Over time, though, the crack becomes bigger, and now it starts to weaken to accommodate the weight. The crack grows and grows, and everything wanes to compensate. Then one day, the bridge just collapses without warning. The first little crack was probably just a remark, an insult, or a small dig, maybe disguised as a joke, and then immediately apologized for. It was probably so subtle, I might not have even noticed it. Then it became more frequent, chipping away at my newly gifted confidence. Arguments started and power struggles ensued. The more he berated me, the more I needed his approval. The more I needed his approval, the stronger he became and the weaker I felt. A male classmate of mine had been flirting with me and had patted my butt in passing. It was harmless, and he apologized after. Don found out about it, and I feared for the classmate's safety. Don had developed a reputation for being quick-tempered when it came to other males, and he loved to fight. His strong frame never let him down. He had been involved in a handful of fights that the coaches from the football team were able to sweep under the rug and keep him from getting in any real trouble from. I begged Don not to act on it, let it slide. After all, he didn't know I had a boyfriend. We fought about it in the living room of his parents' house when no one was home. I was laying on the sofa, and he climbed on top of me and said, "You know what? I think you like it. I think you wanted it. You deserve it. I hope you get raped." In a split-second reaction, I spit in his face. I'd never been hit before by a man, so I never had that type of fear, that type of concern for a rage I could ignite by such a disrespectful act onto someone who easily doubled my weight and size. He sprung off the couch, grabbing my wrists as he did. I went dead weight and resisted. He dragged me to the door. I fought back. He only increased his strength. My wrists were chafing. It hurt. He was shoving me towards the door by any means with no abandon. I was scared. He shoved me outside and locked the door. It was February in Minnesota. It was freezing, and the sun was starting to set. I had no shoes on as I stood on his parents' unshoveled deck. I stood in my long-sleeve shirt and jeans and started to shiver. My feet started to melt the snow and soak through my socks, turning my toes numb. Stunned, I just stared at the door and tried to figure out how to survive. I ran options through my head. I could go to the neighbors, but what would I say? This might be a good time to explain some things about the way I was raised. To be a polite young lady in the first suburb of a big city in the Midwest, you didn't bother people with your problems unless it was life or death. In fact, to show others you might have a problem at all was not normal in my household. To ask for help, especially when it could be embarrassing or futile, was especially shameful. You figure it out. That's what you did, and you didn't let anybody see you sweat. I just wanted to leave, get in my car and go, but my purse and keys, along with my coat and shoes, were locked inside the house with Don. I did the only thing I felt I could. I started quietly begging, pleading, and apologizing through the window of the door. Eventually, he let me back in. I was in a sort of shock after I walked back into the house. It washed over me, and in that moment, it changed how I saw life and how my life would go. Once I got back in the house, I didn't leave. I stayed. We went into the basement, and an eerie silence came over me. He started touching me, wanting to have sex. I told him after what had just happened I was not in the mood. He kept touching me, trying to take off my clothes. I started to cry. I told him I couldn't. I didn't want to. He took down my pants. I pulled them back up. He continued with meticulous focus. I never said no. I didn't fight for my life. He pushed inside of me, and I cried. At some point, I had to rectify and bypass in my mind what the word was and what the act was when somebody ignored my objection for sex and did it anyway. I wondered briefly if he just didn't care that I was upset and resisting him because his own needs mattered more to him, or worse, that my pain and resistance turned him on. I didn't consider it rape then, and oddly, I guess I still don't. Or do I? It's personally one of my most notorious gray areas. He was my boyfriend, and I thought then as I think now, boyfriends don't rape their girlfriends. I felt like a possession to him, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew he was going to have me regardless. So to maintain any sort of power or dignity, I knew I needed to feel like I had a choice. So I chose to let him. I stopped fighting back. I stopped resisting. I didn't say no. There were things that led up to this and many that followed. The order of them are all jumbled in my mind. There were occasions of him hitting me in the leg for no reason, rough handling me during a verbal fight, slamming me against a wall. He never hit me in the face. This was confusing to me because the only domestic abuse I was familiar with was the status quo. I thought that was the main criteria. No one was talking about the subtleties of abuse. No physical proof. No one mentioned the verbal part, where the words they say erode your sense of self and create a falsified trust in the abuser. No one cares for you as much as me. If you didn't push me, I wouldn't have to fill in the blank. It's because I love you so much. The physical stuff was scary, but the mental stuff was worse. The controlling, the isolating, the possessiveness, and the abandonment, or the threat of abandonment. The physical indiscretions we had were a small part of the overall picture that was our relationship. Don was a great liar. I thought I had a little talent in these areas of stretching and omitting the truth, but he blew me away. Don actually believed his own lies. I'd catch him in lies all the time, Some were so small and insignificant I wondered why he bothered lying at all. Some were big. For example, him cheating on me. Information that came from my friend Natasha, who had witnessed it firsthand. She dutifully told me, and somehow he got me to believe that he was the one telling me the truth, and my trusty friend Natasha was lying. Or didn't see what she saw, even though Natasha had no reason to lie to me. I wanted to know the truth, but I hated the way it sounded, and I didn't want to deal with it. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to see the truth because I didn't like it. I accepted lies as my truth, beyond all reasonable doubt. The ways Don was able to control me were really quite brilliant. He slowly made me depend on him for self-worth, and then he'd see how much he could get away with. If he went too far, he'd apologize and be on his best behavior and resort back to the way he'd initially shown me he was. Then it would happen all over again. Each time, I lost a little more sanity and strength. There's one thing that he would do that the repercussions of psychologically have followed me still to this day. We would be at the mall or a restaurant, or he would tell me he was going to drop me off and park the car. Then he would just leave me. First, I would be irritated that it was taking so long. Then I would start to fear that something had happened to him. After all, it shouldn't be taking this long. Something must have happened. I would mill about, watch the clock, and become increasingly anxious. I would start to panic and try to page or call him. He wouldn't respond. I would have little money on me, no transportation, and was too ashamed to ask anyone for help. Eventually, he would show back up, sometimes after an hour or two, and I'd be so relieved that he was okay and or that I wasn't abandoned anymore. I would only feel relief instead of rage. These abandonments followed me for years. I would expect people to leave me in a public place. If they took too long in the bathroom, I'd assumed they left. If they were late, I assumed they weren't showing up. If parking the car took too long, I would start strategizing how I would get home without a ride. The summer before my senior year, Don and I had been together about 2 years. I decided to move to Los Angeles after high school. I had auditioned and gotten accepted into a dance apprenticeship there. Don had his own lofty fantasies of moving to Los Angeles, but had no talents to back up his wild ideas. He had already graduated by the skin of his teeth and was working that summer for my dad's lawn maintenance business. He was saving up to move out of his parents' house and into an apartment with his friend Ian. He had been buying nice things in preparation for the move. In addition to the usual purchases for a first apartment, like a TV and furniture, he told me he had impulsively bought a bird. It was weird. Don wasn't particularly fond of animals. His family didn't have any, and he never seemed interested or connected to any types of animals. I couldn't see him taking good care of any type of pet, and I immediately felt sorry for this bird I'd never met. When I went to his house to hang out, I saw his new pet bird. She was a white and gray dove named Camille. She was beautiful, and her black eyes always seemed to smile when she would cock her head to the side and stare at me. She cooed at me and flirted. I took her out of the cage, and she balanced on my arm. I gently pet her, and she started to fall asleep on me. "Why did you get a bird again?" I asked. "Because she's pretty," he answered smugly. I continued. "Don't you think it's bad for her to live in a dark basement? She doesn't have any fresh air or sunshine." "She loves me," he said, dismissing my concern. Soon after Don bought Camille, he started saying he needed to find her another home. He had come to realize he wasn't really good at taking care of her, and her newness had worn off. I didn't know anyone who wanted a bird, and he wasn't able to return her to the pet store. I worried for the poor, unwanted bird. Where would she end up? Anywhere else, though, had to be better than here, where she spent every day in her prison cage inside of a dungeon. A few weeks later, Don's mom called me in a panic. "Cops are at the house with search warrants. They're saying Don stole some property and they need receipts or they're going to arrest him. Can you find him and tell him he needs to get home?" I raced down the stairs and into the garage and asked my dad what property he was working at. I got in the car and sped to the location. He was mowing and smiled when he saw me walk up. I told him the situation, and his smile dropped. He silently followed me to my car. When we arrived at his parents' house, the cops were waiting outside the front door with their search warrant. The minute he showed up, they followed him inside and down to his room. Don calmly explained he was working for my dad and making good money in cash, which is what he used for most of the items, which is why he didn't have any receipts for them. The police remained unaffected. They didn't believe him. They started to cuff him and read him his rights. His mom and dad were frantic. I was feverishly sorting through piles of dirty clothes and bags of trash, further trashing the already disgusting room. Finally, I found a receipt for something the cops had mentioned they were looking for. "I got one. I found a receipt." The officer snatched it out of my hand and studied it. I felt so good being the hero that would set Don free. "This is for the necklace, and it's a forged signature. This is exactly the evidence we were looking for. You just helped us arrest your boyfriend," the cop said. My eyes welled up, and I felt like the rug had been pulled out from underneath me. The cops pushed Don into the back of their car, while his parents scampered around pleading and finding phone numbers. It turns out Don and some of his buddies had started stealing credit cards out of the lockers at their local gym and were using them to purchase things for their new place. Don spent one night in jail and was bailed out. The scandal rocked his family. My parents had little to say about it. I was grateful they didn't have much to say. I couldn't handle their verbal disappointment on top of my own. They might have come to expect it from him. I don't think either of my parents could really stand Don. They just put up with him because they knew I wouldn't have it any other way. I felt shame being associated with someone who would do something so stupid and immoral. Don's father was a lawyer, so he got out quickly, easily, and was able to take a deal to avoid any time and do community service. He got a slap on the wrist for being a first-time white offender and having the right people around him helping. He went on with his life unfazed and unchanged. But something inside of me had changed. I was changing. I was beginning to detach from him. There was less and less I needed to hang on to. I had become a shell of a person I once was, and nothing could change the trajectory of where my mind was headed. I was at the edge of a cliff. I just needed to jump, or maybe a little push. We were alone in Don's parents' kitchen, and he started taunting me and looking for a fight, verbally violating me. I calmly opened the utensils drawer and picked out a carving knife. He stepped closer to me, continuing his vile attack, unknowing I had a knife in my hand. I turned around and nonchalantly revealed the knife. He froze, mid-sentence. Our eyes were locked in a standoff facing each other. He slowly backed out of the kitchen and sat at the table, staring off into the distance with what looked like defeat filling his eyes. I went downstairs, grabbed my stuff. I looked at Camille one last time and froze. The cage and Camille were gone. I was sad I didn't get to say goodbye to her, but she should have never been in that cage or in that dank basement with no sunlight. She deserved so much better, even if she didn't know it. I hoped she was happy and free. I grabbed my stuff and left. Don never said anything about the knife incident. A week later, I had acquired the courage to call him and break up with him. I usually would have done something like that in person, but the truth is I was afraid of him. He begged and pleaded. I was unwavering. He handed the phone to his mom when his pleas to me didn't work. She took the phone and asked me what was going on. I explained I wanted out through tears. I couldn't tell her the truth. I didn't have the words to explain to his sweet mother that her son was a monster. She heard the sadness in my voice and soothed me. She and Don's dad were always such sweet people. I never could understand how they could have a son like Don. I hung up the phone and vowed to myself I would never again be with anyone who was like Don. The minute I saw the littlest sign, I would leave. And I did, over and over again. Sometimes it took a few minutes. Sometimes it took me 6 months. But I have successfully kept this promise to myself. After we broke up, we never spoke in person again. I spent a while looking over my shoulder just in case. There were a couple times I thought he showed up in places he knew I would be, but he would always hide from me. I would hear things about him every now and again through others, that he'd gotten married, that he'd had a daughter, that he'd gotten divorced, that he had robbed a bank, gotten caught, and served time. He randomly contacted me through email years later. He never mentioned the prison time, but I did. He said it was due to his undiagnosed bipolar disorder. I wanted to believe him a little. I wanted to believe that there was a reason for the way he was. He reminisced about a relationship in a nostalgic way that was completely foreign to me. I told him how I remembered the relationship, and his response was, "It wasn't all bad. We were good together." He never apologized, and I never asked him to. I ceased all communication with him. I'd say I don't know why I didn't leave Don sooner, but after a lot of years of soul searching, it's a little more clear why. I was primed from a young age. My father was often emotionally abusive when he was in a rage, which was frequent. When you experience abuse, you don't stop loving the abuser. You stop loving yourself. Don mirrored how I felt about myself, how I was raised to feel about myself. What I wanted and what I thought I deserved could not coexist. He fit my tattered psyche, just like a glove. If you're listening to this episode and you have or are currently experiencing abuse, I'm sorry and welcome. I hope this helps your journey. You're not alone. Just a reminder for anyone who needs to hear it. The definition of abuse is when someone causes us harm or distress. It can take many forms, ranging from disrespect to causing someone physical or mental pain. It can occur in someone's home, a care home, a hospital, or a public place. Often, the people who commit abuse are taking advantage of a special relationship. The legal definition of abuse is as follows. The term abuse means the knowing infliction of physical or psychological harm, or the knowing deprivation of goods or services that are necessary to meet essential needs, or to avoid physical or psychological harm. You don't need to have been punched in the face or sexually assaulted to experience abuse. Know that whatever you are feeling, there are those among us that have probably felt it too. You are not alone. If you're listening and you have someone you love in your life that is enduring abuse, you are also welcome. You are also not alone. It's hard to watch someone be hurt and feel powerless to help them. I've included various links in the show notes for help and support. If you made it this far, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you were able to find something relatable in today's episode. If you'd like to show your support for this podcast, consider donating on Spotify, or rate, share, comment, and subscribe. As I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, this is also a social experiment to see if in telling my stories, I can embolden listeners to share their stories. If you'd like to share a story on this topic, anonymous or otherwise, on the podcast, please email greymaybestories@gmail.com. greymaybestories@gmail.com. Thank you to everyone who helped make this Grey Maybe podcast happen. Producer and editor Roderick Barge. Cover photo by Jose Perez. Music licensed by Pixabay. Special counsel Jada Ellingham and Roderick Barge. Special shout out to supporters Patty Olgan and Jeremy McCullen. Until next time, bye for now.